GROUPBY and PivotTable have just been released to the current channel for all Microsoft 365 users. So I thought this was the perfect opportunity to do an updated video, because these two functions have the potential to completely change the game when it comes to how we analyze data. So the question here is it time to say RIP pivot tables? Now, 6 months ago, when these functions had just been released to insiders, I posted a video on social media titled RIP Pivot Tables, and it was absolute carnage in the comments section. Because even the mere suggestion that Microsoft might be removing pivot tables from Excel seems to be pretty distressing to a lot of people. So let me just alleviate that concern right now. Pivot tables are not going anywhere, so you don't need to worry about that. The way that you need to look at GROUPBY and PivotTable is that these functions are additional tools in your arsenal. And there are many advantages to using them over using pivot tables, which I'll get into more detail at the end of the lesson. Now, GROUPBY and PivotTable, what exactly are they? Well, they allow us to create pivot table style reports in a more structured way using formulas. So if you are a Microsoft 365 user, then you should have access to these functions. Unfortunately, if you're using an older version like 2021, 2019, or 2016, you're not going to have access to these at the moment. So let's open up the workbook and take a look at the data that we're going to be using. Now here you can see I just have a very basic sales dataset. And this is actually a dataset that I got ChatGPT to generate for me. That is by far my most favorite way of utilizing AI at the moment to create Excel datasets. If I press Control down arrow to go to the last row, you can see we have 500 rows of data, 501 if we include that header. And I'm starting from a clean dataset. We're not going to go through the process of cleaning. This is already clean and I've already put it into an official Excel table. If you're not sure how to do that, the quickest way is to simply press Ctrl T on your keyboard to create a table. You should then see you get a table design ribbon at the top, and I've given my table a name of sales data. And I always recommend that you do name your tables to make them easy to identify. The final point to mention is that currently I have this dataset sorted by the region column A to Z. Now let's set up a scenario. It's 5:30 on a Friday. We're about to head out the door to go for some cocktails with friends, and our manager comes over to our desk because he urgently needs a report. He needs to see the sales, but broken down by department and manager. Now, of course, you could simply put this into a pivot table. So let's do that first of all, so you can get a good comparison between pivot tables and the GROUPBY and PivotTable functions. So I'm just going to throw this data into a quick pivot table. We're going to go to the Table Design tab and summarize with pivot table. I'm going to put my pivot table on a new worksheet. You can see it's picked up my sales data range, which is the name of my table. Click on OK. Now to create this report for him, it's a simple case of dropping the department into rows. I'm going to put the manager underneath in rows as well, and then we're going to grab the sales and put that in values. And very quickly there, I have my answers to give to Bossman. I can see the total sales for sales team 1 and sales team 2. Now, if you're looking at my pivot table and thinking, well, this doesn't look like my pivot table, it's because I have a default pivot table layout, which is tabular format. If I go to the Design tab and into the Layout group, you can see underneath Report Layout, we have the different layouts that we can utilize. So you might be more used to the default, which is compact form. Yours might look like this. I also have a blank row in here, so I could say remove blank line after each item. That's kind of the default that you get when you throw things into a pivot table. Now I'm going to put mine back to tabular layout, and I'm also going to repeat all item labels because this structure of the pivot table is very similar to what the GROUPBY function will produce. So let's try and recreate this, but we're going to use GROUPBY first of all. Let's jump back to our sales worksheet. Now we're going to type in GROUPBY. Now you'll notice that there are quite a few arguments to the GROUPBY function. Remember, the ones that you can see that are in square brackets, those are optional. We don't have to use those. The ones that aren't in square brackets are the ones that the function requires in order to be able to calculate. Now the first argument here is row fields. So if you relate this back to the pivot table that we just created, if you remember, we dragged department and manager and dropped them down into the rows area. So those are our row fields. So all we need to do here is select those two columns from our dataset. So I'm going to go over to my table. I'm going to hover over the department column until I see that black down pointing arrow. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag because these two columns are next to each other. Makes it nice and simple. Notice that I'm not including the column headings just here. We're going to come back to that point in a moment. Comma. The next argument is values. So this is what we want to summarize, which are the sales values. So again, I'm going to hover over the sales column, click once to select it. And then the final mandatory argument is we need to tell the GROUPBY function how we want to aggregate or summarize this data. And you can see in here we have a big long list of different functions that we can use. And we have all of the classics in there: sum, average, count, min, max, as well as some extra ones that you might not have used before, such as percent of, array to text, and also lambda, which is very exciting. And we'll be taking a look at all three of those a bit later on in this lesson. For the time being, let's keep things nice and simple. I'm going to choose sum, and that's all I'm going to do for this first calculation. We're just going to complete those mandatory arguments. Now, when I press enter, I'm going to get exactly what I asked for. I'm getting the departments, and then I'm getting the managers, and then I'm getting a sum of the sales. And you can see that this looks reasonably similar to what we have over here. Here I have subtotals turned on. If I was to turn these off, so let's say do not show, that's pretty much the same thing. So our pivot table and our GROUPBY formula look pretty much the same, except here we've used a formula. Now, one thing to note about GROUPBY is that it will automatically give you a grand total at the bottom. And I know what you're thinking right now, where are the column headers? Well, let's go back to our GROUPBY formula. Now, remember, this is what we consider to be a dynamic array formula. So if I'm clicked elsewhere in my little table just here, notice the formula is grayed out, meaning that we can't edit it. The behavior of dynamic arrays is that we need to be in the cell where we originally typed them in order to edit them, because the way that dynamic arrays behave is that they have spilling capabilities. So they effectively spill the results of the formula down the columns and across the rows. Now, if we click at the end here and press comma, we're now into our optional arguments. And the first one is field headers. So this essentially relates to the column headers. And we have a few different options we can choose. We can choose not to show them. We can say yes, but don't show, no, but generate, or yes and show. Now, if I want to show them, if I was to select 3 just here and press enter, you'll notice that I still don't get my column headers. What it's done is it's added this at the top instead. And Sales Team 2 Bob Smith with this total is basically the first record in our dataset. Now, the reason why it's doing that is because when we constructed our GROUPBY function, I didn't include the headers in my selection. So if you don't select the headers, even if you choose to show them, they're not going to show. So let's do this again, but this time we're going to include our headers in the selection. Now, to select the header as well, we need to click once, click twice, and hold, and then drag across. That will allow us to select the headers for both of those columns. You can see it adds this #all into the formula, which basically means it's including the headers. Comma. We can then select the values, and we need to be consistent here. If we've included headers in the first 2 columns, we need to include headers for sales as well. So for this, we can click once, click twice. Comma. How do we want to aggregate? We're going to do a sum, and this time we're going to say that we want to show the headers. So we're going to put 3 in here, yes and show. When we close the bracket, we should now find we get the same data, except we have those column headers at the top. So all good so far. Let's take a deeper dive into some of those other optional arguments. I'm going to go back to my original cell, click at the end and press comma. The next optional argument we have is total depth, and this just relates to if we want to show grand totals and subtotals in our results. So again, if you relate this back to pivot table, I'm just going to come out of here for 1 second and go back to sheet 1. Grand totals and subtotals in a pivot table are controlled on the design tab. In this group just here, we can choose to show all subtotals at the bottom of the group. We can choose how we want our grand totals to show, and I've got mine turned on for the columns. So we can recreate that using this optional argument. So I'm going to say I want to see them for grand totals and subtotals, which is number 2. Let's press enter. That's exactly what we get. We now have our subtotals in here and then our grand total at the bottom. Now, let's say we've given our report to Bossman. We've got our coat on, we're about to walk out the door to go to cocktails with our friends, and the manager comes running over again. And he's like, Deb, what you've given me is great, but now they want to include the region column as well. They want to see the breakdown by region. Well, because we're using a formula, this is so simple. If we take a look at our formula, you can see the first part here, sales data is the name of the table, and then we have all. So that just means include the headings basically. It's then showing us our row field columns, department to manager, because I selected both of these columns. So if I want to now include the region column, which is next to the manager column, I would just change manager to region in here because it's selecting all of the columns between department and region. So now when I press enter, my formula is going to update, and you can see that we now have the region column included in our results, which is pretty awesome. Don't forget, if you decide that you want to turn off these subtotals, you can just come back to the formula and you can say 0 for no totals, and that will remove the subtotals from your list, from your table. Now, I actually do want subtotals in here, so let's just change that back to 2. The next optional argument is related to sorting. So if we go back up to our formula, comma, the next argument is sort order. Now, we don't actually get any help with this argument. We don't have any useful screen tips popping up telling us what we need to type in. This is just kind of something that you need to know. And the sort order here works very similar to if you've ever used the sort function in Excel. The sort function uses index numbers to know which column to sort by. So taking a look at our results just here, we have if I come out of there so you can see the column headings, you can see we have the department column is column number 1, the manager column is column number 2, region column is column number 3, and the sales column is column number 4. So we can use these indexes to tell the formula which column we want to sort by. And the default sort is to sort in ascending order. So if I wanted to sort this table by the sales in ascending order, sales is column number 4. So all I would need to type in here in the sort order is 4. And that's going to do an ascending sort. And my data was already sorted in ascending, so you won't see too much of a change there. But if you take a look at the sales column, you can see it starts at the lowest and it goes up to the highest for each of the different sales teams. Now, what about if I want to sort by the sales column again, but this time in descending order, so the other way around? Well, instead of using 4 in the formula, we just add a minus onto the front. That tells Excel that we want to do a sort in the other direction, but on the same column. So now when I press enter, it switches that sort around. We now have the highest value at the top going down to the lowest at the bottom of the group. We can also sort on text columns. So far, the only sorting we've done has been on this sales column, which contains values. But what if I want to sort by manager in ascending order? Well, manager is column number 2. Remember, ascending is the default, so we just need to type 2 in here. If I wanted descending, it would be -2. So let's type that in. And now we have the managers in ascending order. If I was to put -2, you can see that those switch the other way around. And it's more obvious in this group, we have all of the A's at the bottom. So pretty simple to sort. Now, a question you might currently have in your head is, can we sort on multiple columns? Well, yes, we can, but there is a little bit of a caveat just here. If I wanted to sort this table by the region column and then by the manager column, I can do that because these are both text columns. So what I would do is go back to my formula, and I want to sort by the region column first of all. And I'm going to do this in ascending order. I think ascending is A to Z. I always get these the wrong way round. Let's do it in ascending. Now, if you want to sort on multiple columns, you need to wrap them in curly braces. So if I want to sort by the region column in ascending order, I would just do a 3 in here because it's the third column, comma. I can then choose the other column that I want to sort by. So let's go for the manager column. We'll do it in ascending again. 2 is what we want in there. Close the curly brace. Press enter, and it's going to sort those results. Now that worked fine, that multiple sort, because I was sorting on 2 row field columns that contain text. If I wanted to sort by, let's say, the region column and then by the sales, this method isn't going to work. Let me show you. I want to sort on the region column so we can keep number 3 in there, but then I want to sort by the sales. So if I put number 4 and press enter, you're going to get a value error. And this was quite the head scratcher for me the other night. I couldn't work out why I was getting a value error when the formula seemed to be correct. And it is because I'm mixing row fields with value fields. So something to bear in mind. Now I'm just going to actually sort on the sales values like so. Now you might be looking at everything I've shown you so far and thinking to yourself, well, this is definitely not easier than pivot tables. If I've got a choice between the two, I'm going to throw my data very quickly into a pivot table and get my answer in a few seconds. And that is very true. I'm going to go through all of the advantages and disadvantages at the end, but the main advantage of using the formula approach as opposed to pivot tables, at least this is the main advantage promoted by Microsoft, is the ability to auto-update. For example, if something in our source data changes, GROUPBY will automatically update. So if you add new data, it will automatically update. If you change something, it will automatically update. So let's change the manager name up here. Let's say we've got a new manager and his name is Adam Adams. If I click away, you can see he's been automatically added into our results table. And even better, it will slot him in the correct position depending on the way that you have this data sorted. If I was to add a new region, so maybe we are now selling in the Midwest, if I press enter, you can see it automatically updates and adds Midwest in. Now, if we go back to our pivot table is now a few steps behind because the pivot table doesn't automatically refresh. We have to go in, we need to right click and click on refresh, and you can see now there is Adam Adams. So that's one of the biggest advantages that Microsoft like to market, automatic updates. I'll leave it up to you to decide if that's a big advantage to you. Now, another advantage, and maybe the more interesting advantage, is that using GROUPBY, we can use text fields in the values area. Let me show you what I mean in the pivot table. Now, currently, the way that we have this pivot table structured, you can see that we have department and manager in the rows area down here, and we have the sum of sales in values. Now, let's say I wanted to have the departments with the managers listed. I'm going to remove sum of sales. I'm going to drag manager across to values. Notice it doesn't do it. It's giving me a count of the manager. It's not actually listing out the manager names. And that is because with pivot tables, we can't have a text field in that values area. It's still going to try and do some kind of aggregation, in this case, count, which is what will happen most of the time when you put a text field down into here. However, with GROUPBY, we can combine it with ARRAYTOTEXT and effectively use a text field in the values area. So let me show you what I mean. Now, ARRAYTOTEXT is one of the new functions that's in that functions dropdown when we're working with GROUPBY. And if you're not sure what ARRAYTOTEXT does, it pretty much does what it says on the tin. It takes an array and it will convert it to text. Let me just show you very quickly a basic example of ARRAYTOTEXT on its own. There's only one mandatory argument here, and that is array. So let's just say I select a few manager names just here and close the bracket. It's going to output them into the cell separated with a comma space. So maybe what I want to do here is I want to have the different sales teams listed out and the managers that belong to those sales teams. So we can use group by. Our row fields, well, those are going to be the departments. We can click twice if we want to include the field header. Comma, we now move on to the values argument. So this is where I want to have the managers listed out. So I'm going to click twice to select managers in that values area. I can then choose the aggregation that I want to use, and this is where we would use array to text, comma. I'm going to turn on or show my field headers. We want a 3 in there, and then I can choose if I want totals or not. So I'm going to say no totals because we don't have any numeric values. Let's close the bracket, hit enter, and that's exactly what we get. We get the 2 departments, sales team 1 and 2, and we get the managers. However, notice something just here. We have duplicates. So you can see for sales team 1, we've got Lucy Chamberlain repeated twice, John Reeves repeated twice, so on and so forth. So this is where, really we want to remove these duplicates from the formula results. How can we do that? Well, because GROUPBY is a function, we can use a function that's going to give us a unique list. And that is, you guessed it, unique. Now, we can't use unique directly with this formula, but because we can create lambdas, we can utilize it in that way. So just before ARRAYTOTEXT, I'm going to type in lambda. Now, if you've never used lambda before, I'm not going to cover that in this session, but I do have a YouTube video, I'll put a link to it up here, that walks you through the process of creating lambdas and explains what they are. But in a nutshell, they essentially allow us to create our own functions. And we do this by assigning variables. So I'm just going to create a quick name for my array to text formula, and I'm just going to call it X. You can call it whatever you like. So we have to give the name that we're assigning to the formula, comma, and then we can have our calculation. So I wanted to do an array to text, but I want it to effectively pass through the unique function. And at the end of our lambdas, we need to tell it what we're using, which is X, and then we need to close off our formulas. So now, if we press enter, we should find that we now have a unique list using array to text and lambda. So hopefully you can see here the potential of this GROUPBY function. It can be so powerful, particularly when you start combining it with lambda. So far in these examples, we've been using columns that are next to each other, making our selections really easy. We've been selecting department and manager, a very simple selection. But what about if you want to create a report where we're using non-contiguous columns, so columns that are not next to each other? Maybe I want to create a little summary report that shows the sales by department and also by product, so 2 columns that aren't next to each other. Well, if you want to do this, we can do it very easily by combining GROUPBY with HStack. And HStack, if you've never used it before, is one of the newer functions in Excel. It allows us to horizontally stack arrays. So you basically can select one array and then another array, and it will put them together side by side, which is kind of what we want this to do. So if we type in GROUPBY, we can then go straight into HStack. And the argument for HStack is just array 1, array 2, array 3. Really simple. So I want to stack the department column, and I'm going to click twice to include the headers, comma, and the product column. Click twice to include the headers. That's all we want to do. Close the bracket. We can now choose our values column, which is the sales column. So I'm going to click twice to select the headers, and then we're into our optional argument. And then we can choose our aggregation method. So I'm just going to use sum again, and then we're into our optional arguments. So I'm going to say yes to show field headers. I'm going to say I want grand totals and subtotals, and my sort order, I'm just going to take the default. So let's just close the bracket, hit enter, and check out what we get. We've got department, product, and sales. So if you want to use non-contiguous columns, make sure you use HStack just to squish them together. Now, an optional argument that we haven't looked at just yet is the filter array argument. If we go to the end of our formula and press comma, and I'm going to skip over sort order so that we move on to filter array. Now, this argument allows us to filter in or filter out specific items from our results. For example, maybe my manager only looks after Sales Team 1. He's not interested in any of the data for Sales Team 2. I could effectively filter out of my results Sales Team 2. So the way that we would do that, I'm just going to move this little screen tip so it's not in the way, is simply to select the department column. And again, I'm going to click twice to include the headings. And we can say we only want to include when it's equal to Sales Team 1. Press enter. And that's exactly what we get. Alternatively, if you prefer to think of it as filtering things out, as opposed to filtering things in, you could choose to use not equal to Sales Team 2. And then you're going to get the same thing. So whichever makes most sense to you. Now I'm going to edit this formula because I want to include the region column in my results. So we need to go to the HStack part of the formula. So we're stacking together department and product so far. And I want to include region. So I'm going to go in the middle here and I'm just going to select the region column. Click once, click twice, and we need a comma in there. So that should stack together the region column as well. Let's press enter, and that's exactly what I get. You can use HStack to define the order of your columns. So I have mine in department, region, and product order. If you wanted to switch them, you could simply switch what you have in here. So instead of region, if I want product first, I could just switch that around. And when we press enter, you can see those columns get swapped around in the table. So really nice and versatile. Now currently I have a filter applied, so I'm only seeing the data for Sales Team 1. But what about if I want to apply multiple filters? So let's say that I only want to see the data for Sales Team 1 and sales that were made in the East region. Can we add multiple filters using this formula? Yes, we can. And the good news is if you know how the filter function works in Excel, then this is going to be a breeze for you. Let's go to the end here where we have our filter array argument. And I'm going to make the formula bar a little bit bigger because this formula is getting pretty long. And let's move our little screen tip out the way. So currently we're filtering out Sales Team 2. Now with the filter function, if you want to filter by multiple pieces of criteria, you need to encase each piece of criteria in brackets. So I'm going to go to the start here of sales data. I'm going to add a bracket, and we already have one on the end. And we can then specify our condition. Because when we're filtering, we can choose to filter for Sales Team 1 and East, or we could say Sales Team 1 or East, or we could say include neither or include both. And the way that we define that when we're working with filter is by which operator we're using to separate the fields. So I've got my first field here, my first piece of criteria, which is that we're filtering out Sales Team 2. I want to do an and, which is an asterisk. I'm going to open another bracket, and my second piece of criteria is that the region, I'm going to click twice to include the headers, must equal East to be included in my results. Close the bracket. I could carry on going. If I wanted to filter by a third thing, I could just do another ampersand or whatever symbol I want to use and carry on going. I need to open brackets, put in my criteria. So entirely up to you. Let's close off group by, hit enter, and now that's what we're getting. We're only seeing results for Sales Team 1 where the sales were made in the East region. So again, super flexible, and if you already know filter, this is really easy. When we're using GROUPBY, we can also create columns that just contain different calculations. For example, maybe I want to see the sales by region, but I want a column for sum, a column for count, a column for average, and then maybe a column that shows the percentage of the total. And again, if we go back to our pivot tables, you might be used to doing something similar to this. Let me just remove count of manager. I'm going to replace it with sales, and we want to do it by region. So I'm going to drop region into rows. Now, currently I'm doing a sum of sales. That's what we have just here. I can double click and I can change this to sum to make it really obvious. But what I could do is drag another sales field down here, but this time I could choose to summarize the values by the count. That gives me another column showing the count. I could drag another sales field down to the pivot table. I can give it a title of average. And we can summarize, right click, these values by the average. And then we can double click, change the name of the column. And if I wanted to show these values as a percentage of the grand total, I could drag another sales field down here. And this time we can right click, we can go to show values as percentage of grand total. And there we have it. Now we can recreate this using GROUPBY. So let's give it a go. I'm going to type in GROUPBY. And let's say I want to summarize by the manager and the region. So I'm going to select these two columns. I'm not going to include the headers just here. Our values are going to be the sales. And then the function I want to use here is hstack again, because technically I want to stack these columns next to each other like we had them in the pivot table. So I'm going to say hstack, and then we can literally tell it that we want one column that does a sum, one that does an average, one that does a count, and one that does a percent of. And this is one of the formulas that we haven't looked at yet. Again, this is fairly new for GROUPBY. So I can essentially stack all of these columns with these inbuilt calculations in them. Let's close that off. Comma, field headers, well, we don't have any. I'm just going to put a 0 in there. And total depth, I'm going to say I want grand totals only. Let's close the bracket, hit enter, check out what we get. We have our managers, we have the regions, and then we have a column for sum, a column for average, one for count, and one for percent of. Notice the percent of column is showing as decimals. We can Control-Shift down arrow, and we can simply change it to percentage formatting and increase the decimals if we want to. So that is another thing. You do need to apply manual formatting to these tables, and you can format them however you like. I'm going to add comma style with 2 decimal places. Again, we could combine this with a filter. So maybe I want to filter out the North region. I'm going to go all the way across by pressing comma straight to the filter array argument. And I want to filter out when the region is not equal to North, like so. Press enter, and now we shouldn't find any records related to the region North. Now, speaking of filtering, I've shown you a couple of ways there that you can use that filter array argument, but one of the things that people love about pivot tables is the ability to add slicers, which give us a nice visual way of slicing and dicing our data. Slice like a ninja. Now, can we use slicers with GROUPBY and PivotBY? Well, we can, but it really isn't all that easy. Now, I'm not going to take up any more time in this video going through how to use slicers with GROUPBY and PivotBY when there is a perfectly awesome video already out there by my friend Mark Proctor. I'm going to put a link to the video up in the corner. So if you would like to see how you can use slicers with these two functions, I highly recommend that you take a look at his video and possibly give him a little follow on LinkedIn and subscribe to his YouTube channel. Now, the final thing I want to talk to you about in relation to GROUPBY is formatting. That is the most obvious difference between the results of our formula and a pivot table. If we take a look at the pivot table, you can see that we have a pivot table style applied. And if we want to, we can go to the design ribbon and we can choose any one of these pivot table styles to jazz up the look and feel of the pivot table. We can even create our own pivot table style so that our pivot tables match our company branding, company logo. Now, can we do this easily with our formulas? Well, not quite, but we could use conditional formatting to make this look a little bit better. So let's say that I want to apply some formatting to the header row so it stands out from the rest of my data. The way that you need to do this is you need to look in the first column, which is where conditional formatting is going to look, and find something that's unique to the row that you want to format. So I want to format the top row here. So what I could say is look in column H for a blank and then apply conditional formatting to that row. So it should find this first cell just here and the formatting will apply. So let's make our selection. I'm going to select the entire table, go to conditional formatting and new rule. I'm going to use a formula, and the formula that we want to use is we're going to say look in this column and we need to select the uppermost left cell. And notice that by default, it's going to make this an absolute reference. Now, if we were to leave this and say apply formatting to $H$2, it will literally only apply formatting to that cell because that's what absolute referencing is. It locks it to the cell. Now, what we want to do here is basically say, look down column H. So it needs to be able to move down column H only. So we want to lock column H, but we want the formatting applied across all of the row. So this is where we can use mixed referencing. If I press F4 twice, it's going to lock the column, but not the row, which is what we want. So I can say here, if in column H you find a blank, then apply formatting. Let's click on format. I'm going to change the background fill and we're going to choose a blue background fill. Let's go for bold font and we'll make it white. And I'm going to let's give it an underline border as well. Click on OK and OK again and check it out. It's now applied that formatting to that header row. We could do something similar if we wanted to format the total row just here, but this time when it's looking through column H, we could say when you find the word total, apply formatting to the row. So once again, we're going to select Control A, conditional formatting. Let's do a new rule. We're going to use a formula, and this is pretty much structured in the same way. So we want to make sure that we select that first cell, H2, press F4 twice. So we have mixed referencing, and this time we're going to say when it's equal to total, apply the formatting. And this time we're going to go for, let's go for bold italic, and we'll put a border across the top this time. Click on OK and OK again. And if we scroll down, we should now find that we have our total row formatted. So you can make your pivot tables look pretty decent utilizing conditional formatting. So far, we've been exclusively taking a look at GROUPBY, but obviously there is another function called PivotBy. Now, the reason why I've left this to the end is that if you understand how GROUPBY works, then PivotBy is a complete breeze, because these two functions are pretty much exactly the same. The only difference is that with PivotBy, we can create matrix style reports because we have additional arguments related to columns and not just rows. So if we take a look at our pivot table again, and let's remove some of these values that we added, I'm just going to do a sum. So currently I only have region in rows and sum in values. If I was to add manager into columns, that's going to give me more of a matrix style. I could even rearrange these to make it look a little bit neater. So you can see now we have the region in the columns and we have the manager in the rows. So if you wanted to recreate something that looks like this, where we have fields in the columns area, that is where you would use PivotBy. And all of the arguments are exactly the same in PivotBy for the columns as when we use GROUPBY and the rows. So let me show you a quick example. So let's say that I want to use PivotBy to summarize the sales by product and by year. And you can see in the date column, I actually only have 2 years worth of data for 2022 and 2023. So we can type in PivotBy. Our column fields, well, those are going to be the products. I'm not going to include the headers just here. Our column fields, well, this is going to be the year. Now, I only want the year, I don't want the full date, so I need to extract the year from the dates in column A. Comma. My values are going to be the sales. I can choose what function I want to use. I'm going to do a sum. I'm going to say no to show headers because we didn't select them. I want grand totals on for my rows. I'm not going to worry about the sort order, I'll just accept the defaults. And then it moves on to column total depth. So these are the additional arguments that we have when we're using PivotBy. So I can choose if I want to see totals, why not? Let's do a 1 in here, and then I can choose the column sort order. Now, again, I'm just going to leave it on the defaults, close the bracket, hit enter, and you can see exactly what we get. We now have the data for 2022, 2023, and the totals. I'm going to go in, apply some formatting, and then I could use conditional formatting to make this table look a little bit better. So those are some of the ways that you can use the GROUPBY and PivotBy functions. And I'm pretty sure I know what you're thinking at this stage. Pivot tables are so much easier. and you would be correct. However, my good friend Matt Brattin recently made an excellent post on TikTok explaining why he doesn't use pivot tables. And he raised some really excellent points in his video that you might want to consider when you're trying to decide whether to go down the pivot table route or whether to use these functions. So let's take a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages. Now, the advantages of pivot tables are pretty obvious. They are flexible and fast. We can drag and drop fields. They're user-friendly. Pretty much anybody with a few Excel skills can build a pivot table. They're easy to format. We can apply pivot table styles and even create our own custom styles. And they're great for exploratory analysis. If you want to slice and dice your data, move things around, then pivot tables are the perfect tool for this. And of course, we can use slicers for visual rapid filtering. So what are the disadvantages of using pivot tables? Well, we saw a couple of these in the video. No automatic update. You need to remember to right-click and refresh in order to incorporate any new data that's been added into the source. We're limited to the inbuilt aggregation functions. We can do a few things in pivot tables like sum, count, min, max, average, so on and so forth, but we don't have access to as wide a range of functions as we do when we're using GROUPBY and PivotBY, particularly because we can utilize lambdas. And this final point is really the point that Matt was trying to make. And that is, these aren't as professional as a structured report. Most of the time when we're creating a pivot table report, we want to send that report to somebody else. And it might be that those are really important people. It could be your CEO, maybe it's stakeholders. If you just send them a pivot table, it doesn't look particularly professional. Pivot tables effectively aren't really the end product. They're great for quickly grabbing figures and manipulating your data. But when it comes time to actually send a structured report out to important people, you don't really want to send just a raw pivot table. That is where you might want to consider using GROUPBY or PivotBY. Now, the advantages of these two functions, well, we can automatically update and we can apply a wide range of aggregation functions. They're also a lot easier to use with macros. Occasionally, you'll have problems with macros and pivot tables. And both of these functions are much more efficient when you're working with large datasets. Now, the drawbacks of these two functions, I'm sure you can think of a few. These do require a little bit of formula knowledge. These would fall more under the intermediate to advanced bracket when it comes to formulas. So these are not going to be suitable for complete Excel beginners. Generally, they are slower. Drag and drop in fields is really quick. We can get a result in a few seconds. Whereas it does take a little bit longer to put together a formula. The result is harder to format. As we've seen, we can't just apply a pivot table style. We need to utilize conditional formatting, which again requires some knowledge in formulas. And of course, the biggest one is that they are limited in their availability. They are only available to Microsoft 365 subscribers. So anybody who has an older version, 2021, 2019, isn't going to have access to these functions. Now, my personal opinion on this is that I'm not going to be ditching pivot tables anytime soon. But I'm a trainer. I don't necessarily work in an industry where structured reporting is important. I know for particular groups of people, such as financial modelers, then GROUPBY and PivotBY are going to be awesome. So it really depends what your job role is and what your end goal is. I don't see these as a replacement for pivot tables. I see them as an alternative that we can use for a different purpose. If you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to connect with me. You'll find me across all of the social channels. I'm on LinkedIn. You can see if you'd like to connect with me to further your learning, I do post daily tutorials on LinkedIn and TikTok. Then feel free to scan the QR code that you can see in the top corner. That's going to take you through to my Linktree account where I have all of my social media accounts linked. Let me know down in the comments what you think of GROUPBY and PivotBY. Have you used them? What do you think? That's it for now, guys. I'll see you later.